Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there in person in Newcastle today. I really wanted to be. I haven't been to Newcastle in many years. If don't let the accent confuse you, I am actually a Yorkshire boy through and through. I've spent my life in other places as well, but generally come back to the north. Although I'm in London right now, so maybe we'll see. We'll see how this goes. All right. So today I'm going to talk through uh, a day I spent at an old company a couple of years ago where we looked at what red teaming looks like in the cloud environment. What can you use red team for? How can you use that to really drive culture? Now, the company I'm at now and the company I was at back then, they were both consultancies. And where this came in was for us, we go out, we work with businesses all over, and we're always trying to improve things where we are. And also, at the end of the day, we can't be a liability going into clients. So how can we make it so everyone in delivery at the consultancy, we're able to look at things with a security mindset, with the right lens, with the right view on the world? Because a lot of them were application developers, really, a lot of them. Yet we needed all of them to up their security game as we went along. So how can you do that? How can you make change happen in a business like that? And I'm going to start off with probably the only thing, I guess, if there's one thing you remember from today, I'd like it to be this because I think it's the most fun part. Hopefully, you remember the other stuff as well. But there's this amazing word in Japanese called sujigiri. And after giving this talk a few times, no one's ever known what this means straight away. I can't be there in person. I can't see if anyone knew it today. But what it means is trying out a new samurai sword on a random passerby. Truly an amazing word. And really, this was kind of the ethos that we took into the day, and how this all links together will become more apparent as we go through. Unfortunately, I have to do an obligatory about me slide, for which I apologize unreservedly. I'll try and go quickly. Who am I? I'm Josh Armitage. What do I do? I'm the AWS practice lead at Contino here in London. And why you should listen to me about security? The best answer I've got for that is I spent 13 years in a prison colony. You may know it as Australia, but I still think that counts. Also, I am, working heavily towards being an O'Reilly author as well. So I'm writing a cloud native security cookbook. There's an early release out on O'Reilly Learning as of last night. As it happens, this is very well timed. So if you think at the end of this that potentially what I say is interesting or informative or other things like that, you can go and check out the book. You can find me on all the socials, all that kind of good stuff. So in security, a lot of the time, always talk about shift left. You shift security to the left. Earlier in your CI/CD pipeline, you want to do that. And I kind of warped that concept a little bit with this, where talking about shift left learning. How can you bring learning forward? I saw a quote the other day. I think it was from Kelsey Hightower saying, "There's no compression algorithm for experience." And when it comes to security, how can you give people the experience they need in a safe way? You don't want everyone to have to learn everything when a security issue goes off at 3 o'clock in the morning and everyone gets pulled into the SOC, right? Instead, how can you bring this forward? How can you make it so they learn now? And I think everyone's seen this graph or similar ones where you see that over time, cost exponentially grows. The later you leave it to get this learning in and understand how your security posture works, what you should do in particular scenarios, the later you learn it, the more expensive it's going to be, right? You don't want people learning everything about your security process when a real security incident happens. That's the worst time to learn, because that's the time of highest risk and highest cost. So how can you bring that forward? And we're just going to step through a few mental models or approaches that I think help frame everything else. So the first one is from US Secretary of Defense. Want to say I got the title right, Donald Rumsfeld, where he split kind of knowledge into 3 different buckets. You've got your knowns, You've got your known unknowns and you've got your unknown unknowns. And we'll just step through those quickly now. So the known knowns are the things you know. I mean, seems almost redundant on the face of it, but there are things you know, right? And in this kind of scenario, security is everyone's responsibility, right? Everyone should know that. It's a known for the entire company. It's not the security function's job to do security for everyone. One, it doesn't scale, and two, I think we all know that generally the weakest link in any business of security is the people, unfortunately. And it really needs to be this ethos of it's everyone's responsibility. And the consultancy I was at the time, this was the approach that we took. Everyone's responsible for security. It's not just one person's job or a team's job or anything else. Nearly every business has an incident response process. I always get curious when thinking about how long it's been since someone read that. Often, maybe they read it on onboarding. Do they ever look at it again? Maybe if they've got mandated training every 12 months. But all they've ever done is just read it off a page in Confluence or wherever, SharePoint, wherever your documents are stored. There normally is one. People maybe read it once, or at least they check a box saying they've read it right. And in this is kind of an interesting bit, this next bit, because this was done pre-pandemic, but this was a consultancy. So by nature, we were a distributed team across the city we were operating in at the time. So people were everywhere. And for the red teaming event that we ran, we didn't want to add the complication of having to communicate asynchronously over Slack and everything else. We wanted people to be together. So we didn't want to test that our communication pathways were sufficient right now. We wanted to test other things, right? If you take scientific method, you want to control variables and only change one thing at once, not add a whole heap of different variables into the equation, because then you can't figure out what happens and what the problems are, and then you can't really move forward. So in this case, for the consultancy, we called it a company day, and we pulled everyone on site together. Again, pre-pandemic, but that was something that we decided to make easier for the surprise blue team. Another thing we thought we knew was the expected avenues. So if we start messing with the AWS environment, we thought we knew how people would react, where they go, what they try and do in the first instance. We thought we knew that. Yes, and when I get through the end of the talk, we'll kind of cover off whether we were right about that or not. Okay, so moving on to known unknowns. So these are the things we know we don't know in this space. So what were the things we were trying to learn? What were the questions that we knew of that we wanted answers to? And when it comes to something like this, how do you measure performance? And this isn't about measuring whether you did good or bad. That's completely inconsequential for this. It's not about grading performance. It's about getting a baseline so you can say, next time we've got better, or next time we've got worse. It's not about carrot or stick. How do you measure the impact, like the response to a red team activity, especially one that they didn't know was going to happen? We picked 3 metrics for this. First was time to identify. How long until they realize something's going on? Time to contain. How long until those of us having all the fun under red team lost all our access and the problem wasn't getting any worse at that point? And lastly, percentage of intrusion detected. So of all the things we did in AWS, all the resources we spun up, all the things we did all over the place, what percentage of those were they able to find? Because when it comes to the cloud, and when you talk about AWS, or GCP or Azure or Alibaba or any cloud you want, the thing is, with the flexibility and the power there, things can get out of control fast, right? Like I can spin up things in regions and accounts and all over the place. And we did. So when it comes to this, do you have the right tools in place to even find everything that people did, right? Can you even find your way back to understanding how bad the security incident actually is? Another question we wanted answered was, who's going to take responsibility? So when we planned this out and it was planned with the leadership team and a couple of chosen people, of which I was one. I like to think they chose me for technical skills. It may just because I can be somewhat sadistic, and they knew that I would take this maybe a little bit too seriously and see how far we could go with this. But we took effectively all the senior leadership out of the room. And this was another thing we wanted to understand is without, the normal people, without, I mean, I think everyone normally knows there's a person on the people everyone turns to. And one of the things we wanted to test is what happens if none of them are there? Who's going to take up responsibility? Who's going to take charge in that scenario? Because we had a mixed experience level, junior, more senior, and everything else. So this is something we wanted to understand as well. And another thing that generally happens is whenever you scale a process to looking after 3 times what it was initially designed for, it generally tends to break. Now, at the consultancy at the time, when I joined, it was about 10 people. And when we did this, it was about 30. And we had it in the back of our minds that the process that we had that served us very well about 12 months before this, would it still hold with the company at 3 times the size that it was? And the last one is just, for me, is to understand, and I come back to this concept quite a lot, is what lenses do people possess? Now, in my career, I've worked in a whole variety of different fields, including security. So I feel I can look at problems in different ways. And I always like to understand, how do people look at problems? Because that will help you figure out what solutions they're going to kind of drive towards. Like application developers generally try and look at, does the thing work? How can I make the new thing? Security generally look on effective security problems, and operations look, how do I keep this running in production? And one of the important things to do with people is you want, T-shaped people that have a wide range of skills. Not, they have their deep areas as well, but you want them to have a wide range of skills. So when they look at the problem, they can see it from different viewpoints. And this was to understand, were there any people in the business who had a security lens that we didn't know about, who were able to look at the problem in the way that we wanted them to automatically? Or is there a massive gap here and we need to do more? And unknown unknowns, obviously we couldn't know these in advance, because this is the idea of the things you don't know yet. If you don't know, you don't know it. You can't plan what the question's going to be. So we knew by doing this that we would turn up things that we didn't expect. And that's part of the excitement going into it, right? You get your business value based on the things you don't know, and then you will find out more things as you go along by taking action, by making it real, by building your culture through action. You can uncover some things, right? You can't just sit there and think about it and actually learn what you actually get through real action. And the same concept exists in the operations sphere with chaos engineering. You don't know how your system's going to react in a certain scenario. So you make the scenario happen and see what happens, because you can't think your way through it. Things are too complex nowadays to be able to think your way through the problem entirely. A big suggestion, if you want to do this yourself, is set up some rules of engagement. So we had a few ground rules that were set for the red team. One of them was cost. We could only spend so much money on AWS. Like when you have the cloud and all of a sudden you can run up virtual machines that cost an insane amount of money, like it can quickly spiral. And that we weren't trying to bankrupt the company, we're just trying to learn things. So there were some limits put in place. Also, there were things that me and my partner in crime for this, Will, that we were blocked from being able to do. Like instantly you can go and we could destroy identity and permissions and everything else, and effectively just make it so the blue team could theoretically do nothing. Not fun, kind of detracts from the purpose. So there were limits to what we were allowed to do. We had some ideas that like, oh, this would be awesome, but it kind of defeats the point. So setting up these rules of engagements, this is about having a healthy tension between the teams, because this is a learning exercise. So you want people to be learning, so you need to give some to and fro, some ability to go back and forth, and some flexibility in there. Not just everyone wins or no one wins on this. It wasn't a competition. It was, how can we do the best for everyone? And now I've potentially bored you all to tears with mental models and preparation. Let's actually step into the day and what happened. And I'm going to run through a timeline of what happened on the day, just so you get an idea. So we kicked off at 10 a.m. As I said before, we called everyone together in the company to be co-located together in the office. And myself, Will, and the 3 directors made an excuse to, we've got to go look at something, we'll be back. All we did was walk next door to the coffee shop and just open laptops and set up and get ready to go. But we removed ourselves physically from there, because otherwise it gets pretty obvious if something's going on and you're sitting there in a corner hacking away and everyone's like, why aren't you helping? It's like, maybe because it's me that's doing it. Another thing we did with this, and I mentioned before that there was a variety of seniority in the room, going from junior to senior. One of the things we wanted to do as part of this is make sure the juniors got involved. Not that they wouldn't want to get involved, but not allow the seniors to kind of take control and fix things without including other people. So when we did this, when we looked at whose permission to take away, we took away all the senior team, all the senior members' permissions to be able to do anything, and left all the junior members with permission. And the idea was that the seniors then had to channel what they were thinking, their approach, what they wanted to do through the more junior people, and really kind of a pairing approach on this. And I think that's really critical, because otherwise the people that already know a lot retain that knowledge and it doesn't get spread. So at 3 minutes past 10, we tripped a wire. So this being our own environment, we didn't have to do a bunch of OSINTs, but effectively we knew we could do things that would cause alerts to start going off, so people would start to understand that things were happening. In this particular consultancy, we were a serverless first consultancy. So what we had was, if anyone ran up an EC2 machine anywhere, an alarm would go off, because generally there wasn't any reason for an EC2 machine to be alive in any of our AWS accounts. So we did that, and we knew that was there. And again, this comes back to that. This is about learning, not about winning. It's not a competition. So, give people a chance to fight back. Give the blue team a chance. Because at this point, they don't even know they're a blue team. They're all working on other projects and, things for the day. They don't know this is happening yet. Also at 10:03, we decided to phish them as well. So we had compliance tooling on all our AWS accounts. We'd already pre-made an email to send out to see if we could get people to click it. And seeing that this company was effectively 95% engineers, you would really hope that no one clicked it. A few people clicked it, and they went through. So this was also interesting. These are kind of things like table stakes things that you think that people would know better. At the end of the day, phishing is unfortunately effective, even in 2021. So 6 minutes after we triggered the alarm, and 6 minutes after we sent the phishing email as well, someone smells smoke. So at this point, someone noticed, they put on Slack saying, hey, I think there's something fishy going on. Can people down tools, can someone come have a look with me? Paul, the guy who realized this, was one of the more senior people, and his permissions had already been removed, so he couldn't get in. A minute later, someone went to help him, and we instantly blasted her credentials as well. And you might ask, how did we know what was going on? Because we were no longer in the room, we were next door. We had a fly on the wall. So we had someone on the inside who knew what was going to happen, knew it was happening, and was there to relay information back to us of what was happening in the room. Because again, we didn't want this to be too stressful. We wanted the jeopardy to feel real enough, but not everyone to stress out of their minds, to go crazy and everything else. So having, again, that ability to go back and forth is critical, and know that you're not pushing too hard and giving that to and fro aspect to it. So we had a spy in their midst, which was quite amusing. So 3 minutes after someone thought something fishy was going on, Paul sent out a company-wide blast going, okay, not a drill. Something is actively happening in our accounts. I need everyone to stop what they're doing, and we need to mob around this. 5 minutes after that, the CEO of the company, the founder, was sitting across the table from me, quite happily drinking a coffee, got a phone call. from one of, I think it was from Paul. And I got to see him have a massive grin on his face and turn his phone upside down and just sit there and do absolutely nothing. The interesting thing about this was this is step one of our incident response plan. So even with a well-defined incident response plan, people did other things before they went and read it and did the first thing on there, right? So this is one of the ways that you want to understand what's going on and one of the interesting things. Another thing we hadn't really thought about too much before was how would the blue team self-organize? Organically, they were going to arrive at some kind of structure of how they were going to try and approach and tackle the problem. What was that really going to look like? What we ended up seeing was effectively this. So you had Paul at the top and what ended up being about 15 people, I think, on the day, underneath him, all feeding information back to him. You can probably imagine what happened. Effectively, his head set on fire. There was too much information coming at him. He couldn't handle anything. There was no clear direction and everything else. So 11 minutes after that phone call was placed, they had we need to stop and regroup. We need to figure out, we need to get an idea of what's actually happening. We need to marshal resources, all those kind of things. And at 10:30, they did an access poll. So who still has access to our environments so they can understand how many people they could channel change through, who are the people who still have access. So how can they parallelize what they're doing? How can they go with the best approach forward? What was interesting with this is someone claimed to not have access when he very much still did. We hadn't taken away his, yet he claimed he didn't have access, which is also an interesting learning. And it's not that this is about punishing people or finding stuff out, but it's about the feedback loops. Now we could go back and go, okay, well, why did you think you didn't have access? And it's not like, you should have been like, no, yes, I have access. But how can we use that as a feedback loop to help coach, support, find all these things? And we didn't expect anyone to say they didn't have access when they did, right? But these unknown unknowns, you turn up as you go along. So 7 minutes later, they decided to have a more mindful structure. So they had a comms role and a leader role. So instead of everyone going into one person, you had someone in there whose job was to take all the incoming information, filter it, and pass it to the leader who was trying to kind of do the grand plan, the strategy, and figure out what they were going to do. This served them a lot better at this point, being able to filter and everything else. But again, if you were to do this again, they would naturally fall into this structure as opposed to the initial structure where it didn't really work and it didn't scale. So by doing these things, people learn things, they get that experience. It really moves them forward. 4 minutes after that, they kicked out the spy, the fly on the wall that we had. Yeah, they're like, why aren't you helping? And he's like, and they're like, okay, you can get out. Because at this point, we had told them that this was us. I mean, most of them had figured it out for themselves that this wasn't a real attack, but it was an attack being perpetrated from within. And, we told them, because again, we didn't want the stress levels to go too high. We wanted it to be a learning experience. So, we messaged them saying, hey, but treat it as if it's real. And also they now knew who was on the other side, and consultants are on the whole generally a competitive lot. So if anything, this might have even amped them up a little bit more in terms of trying to get one over on us. Stress levels went down, which was what we were trying to drive for, but that was something quite important on the day that we wanted to make sure that they were aware. 7 minutes after that, I managed to find GitHub tokens that were unencrypted and stored. So we managed to break out of AWS. Fantastic. Now I was off in GitHub, creating private repos to not be too cool for the guy who'd accidentally left his credentials lying around. But, this is all those kind of things that when you're in the cloud and you're kind of trying to go cloud native, you think that, you think about everything in the walled garden. And sometimes people don't think about, okay, well, if I don't do this properly in AWS, the problem moves. I think from a security angle, quite used to this kind of idea that you get a beachhead and you can move wider from there. But sometimes in the cloud, it can be something that people don't think about. And really what this comes down to, and something that I always talk about, probably too much at length, is the core components of AWS. And one service that is amazing, but it's probably not something that most people get familiar enough with. And that's KMS, like the key management service. And it's KMS in GCP, and it's KMS in Azure, and it's KMS in every cloud. They all use the same title for this one, which is nice and easy. But effectively, he'd encrypted his GitHub credentials at KMS, but hadn't set the key policy correctly, the resource policy on the key. So it's encrypted at rest, but anyone in the account could get the credentials back out. And this became a learning moment. He's like, oh, I thought I'd done the right thing. Can you help me with this later? So this was, an option to find it and then go, okay, cool. No, this is how you want to do KMS. So you can only the right people can access it and stuff like that. And only you can access your credentials. So you find these little teachable moments, and done with the right mindset, people aren't trying to hide away from the fact they did something wrong, but they're trying to approach it with this learning mindset, this growth mindset that's so critical. So 2 minutes after I broke out of AWS, all silent on the Western Front, they decided that if they were going to try and combat us, they probably shouldn't be putting everything they're trying to do on Slack where the red team can see it. So we could see what they were thinking about what they were trying to do, and then we could always stay one step ahead, right? So at that point, they all went into Google Hangout, I think it was, and started using the chat in there because that was just something simple to set up. So at this point, we'd lost the visibility of Slack. Our fly on the wall had been sent out. And we're like, okay, we don't know what they're doing anymore. So as the red team perspective, we've got no idea what they're doing to try and combat us. We don't know how things are going there. We don't know whether to push harder, pull back, or anything else. Because we always tried to stay only a bit in front, not like hugely in front, but only ever just that bits they could chase and feel like they were making progress. So what do you do at that point? You throw the COO and the CTO in back into the room because they can't kick them out, and they can still feed us some amount of information so we can find out what's going on. And also the Paul who'd been leading it all had been pretty stressed out by it, as you can imagine. And, we wanted to go, okay, we'll put the CTO is going to come back in. He can take over running that if you want, giving that option to kind of de-stress a little bit. Because although we now knew it wasn't real, I think the stress peak, those kind of things, give people the option to kind of swap out and everything else. And 3 minutes after that, the blue team said that, yeah, we think it's all under control. We don't think we have access anymore. We think we've got it contained. They had not. So Will and I stepped up our game a little bit. We started creating some things with names appropriately so they would know that these were new and everything else. And, 18 minutes later, they came to the conclusion that no, it was not over. It was still going. And 5 minutes after that, Will and I decided to send some photos on Slack of us very happily hacking away next door, just to kind of, make sure that we're all focusing on this as being fun and learning, not something super serious. And 8 minutes after that, they actually did contain us. They got everything that we're doing. All our access was revoked and everything else. So, they actually managed to get on top of it. And 22 minutes after that, Will and I decided to just chill for a little bit and then went back. And we went back into the room. And if you've never walked into a room and been flipped off by everyone in the room at once, it's quite an experience. And that was quite amusing to me at the time. But we returned to the room, and then it went from, okay, the red team part is done. We need to move from containment to remediation on this. So all in all, we're talking about this is 2 hours of some amount of pre-work and investment in deciding what we're going to do and everything else. The actual scenario itself took about 2 hours. And we'd set a time limit on this as well. We weren't going to run past 1 o'clock from memory. I think we'd said 3 hours max. If they haven't contained it by 3, we're just going to stop and we're just going to move to remediation, because we wanted to make sure we got through the entire life cycle, not slowly just keeping going on the same track. And me being a massive lean theory junkie, one of the things we're always trying to drive in these things is the concept of Kaizen, change for good, or continuous improvement, the most common English translation. So when I say that this is about improving and everything else, I'm going to talk the specific numbers. I mean, you may have been able to follow some of the numbers as we went along, but again, I always want to reiterate this isn't. I don't know whether these numbers are good or bad. I just know that's where we were at that point in time, and now we have something we can improve on. So the time to identify. So from us doing something to people considering it an active security incident was 12 minutes. The time to contain was an hour and 28 minutes. And when it got down to it, the percentage of the intrusion detected, the amount of stuff they found after a couple of hours of remediation and just trying to get on top of things, we gave them some time to try and do cleanup. It's about 66%. So they found about 2/3 of the stuff we did. So, given they had twice as much time as we did to get on top of it, they still only managed to find 2/3. And I think it was kind of Pareto principling a little bit. I think even with another couple of hours, that number probably only moved to 75 or something, because the things that were stopping them from finding stuff now were they weren't going down the right thought paths. And this was with me and Will in the room trying to lead them gently down the path. We didn't go, oh, we did this here. We went, have you thought about this? And tried to see if people could arrive at the right path themselves to go and find what we did. And also, one of the things you want to do in this is you want to keep a running tally of everything you did do, which we did in Slack. So everything we did, we made a tally, so then we knew we could go back and find it. So we didn't leave things lying around for the rest of time because no one could find it. One of the interesting things that came out of this was one of the first questions was, but is this realistic? Which I found really interesting because we put quite a bit of thought and effort into making sure that it was a realistic scenario. And effectively, this could have all been done off one set of compromised credentials. Effectively. So I thought it was a very realistic scenario. But for the other people, like, oh, but this wouldn't really happen. And it's like, yes, it absolutely could. We tried to keep this realistic. I think sometimes with security, and I imagine most people in the room and online have done this, like security, thankfully, most people haven't had to go through real security incidents in businesses, right? So sometimes it's not real to them until it is. And I think once you go through one, then you get it, right? And that, again, that's almost the point of this exercise that we did, was make it real now as opposed to waiting until it's actually real. Because the end thing about security is it's not if an incident happens, it's when an incident happens. And I always come back to backups never fail, restores do. If all you ever do is back up machines and you never restore them, that's never really the problem, right? If you do backups but they're unrestorable, doing the backup is irrelevant. So having an instant response process and having all this stuff in place is great, but if you never test it, if you never prove it out, if you never make it real, then that's not worth all that much. And fundamentally, what I took away from this, and where I kind of got my idea around what the difference between the red team and the blue team were, and what we needed to do going forward to enable the blue team to fight back harder and faster, came back to 42nd Boyd, John Boyd, the famous pilot and part of the Air Force in the US. And he has this concept of an OODA loop. And yeah, comes from the idea of dogfighting in airplanes. And the idea is this loop of observe, orient, decide, and act. And if you can cycle through these four quicker than your opponents or the other side, you can outmaneuver them, you can move faster than them, and you will win. And really, when it came down to it, we didn't have tools in place to observe, to be able to see what's going on. This observability, and really came down to just there wasn't enough tooling in place. So the red team were off doing things, and the blue team just couldn't see what was happening. And because they couldn't see what was happening, they couldn't orient, they couldn't decide, they couldn't act. And the amount of time it took them to observe what was happening, by the time they got through that, we'd already gone and done more things. So they're always operating on stale information. And that really was, for me, the fundamental learning that I took away is, okay, what can we do to improve this? How can we give people the observability to understand what's going on across all our environments? And, as we talked, as we worked, as we identified things, we were capturing improvements as we go along, things we wanted to do, things that we thought were good ideas based on what we learned from this. And we slapped them all into Jira, because what else do you do with good intentions and good ideas? And what this became was a living backlog that, as a consultancy, our bench capacity, anyone on bench who didn't have something very specific they needed to do, just worked away at this backlog. And that was just how we approached things. And that's how we just, day after day, week after week, we improved on where we were at. One of the interesting things that came of this, ended up being the beginning of a tradition at the company. I'm no longer with that company, and neither is Will, for legitimate reasons at the time. But this is still something that's talked about. It's still something that new people coming to the company hear about and learn about. It's become one of those cornerstone myths of the culture of the company. This is something that will live with the company for as long as the company exists. It really made a focus on security, to take the AWS parlance for security as job zero. Effectively, the company made the investment of, we're going to have no revenue for a day in order to make security important, in order to make people learn and make people realize how important security is to us. We're actually, as a consultancy, there was no billable time that day. That's the level of investment we made. And it's not, for a giant enterprise, they can't just not have anyone work for a day, right? But really, it's hard to tell people security is important if the investment isn't there, right? If all the investment goes into the security function, but the teams there's never a trade-off against delivery. And it's just one of those things that really needs to happen and really makes it real to people and makes people sit up and pay attention. And I'm just going to end off with just why red team. If you were going to sell this, or when I do sell this into businesses and raise it up a lot as something important, is I'm going to use a chess idea just to finish it off. So the difference between a novice and a master. So a novice chess player looks at the board and sees on their side 16 pieces. And there's the opposing 16 pieces. And the way they look at the board is all about the individual pieces moving around. When you get to a master, they look at the board in patterns and groups and chunks. So they're able to move more quickly because they already have experience and they're reusing that experience when it comes down to it. And really, at the end of the day, if a real security incident happens in your business, would you rather have novices around you, or would you rather have masters? I think there's only one answer to that question. And that's all I had. Hopefully that was good for people. I think, around somewhere in Gathertown for questions, or if someone is able to get the questions to me, then I believe I have 5 minutes left for any questions, or find me on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever you want and come and ask questions later. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff.
Awesome. It's working. Yep. I don't see any questions yet in the chat. So let's give it another check.
Yeah, if there's no questions, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any yet.
No, good. Well, I hope everyone has a wonderful conference and a wonderful weekend. And for all those in Newcastle, have a lot of fun.